The winter sky over Germany was iron gray that December morning in 1943. High above the clouds, the sound of engines echoed faintly, the steady hum of a war machine pushing against the cold. Inside a battered B-17 bomber, a young American pilot named Charlie Brown fought to keep his aircraft alive. The plane had been chewed apart by enemy fire. Sheets of metal flapped like torn paper, wires hung loose, and the cold wind sliced through holes in the fuselage, biting at the men inside. They had taken heavy damage after a bombing run deep in enemy territory. Anti-aircraft shells had torn through the wings. One engine was out completely, another sputtering. Several of the crew were wounded, and one man lay motionless in the tail section. Charlie could smell the smoke of burned oil and blood in the air. He was only in his early 20s, but war had aged him beyond those years. His hands shook from exhaustion and adrenaline as he wrestled with the controls. They were alone now, separated from the formation. Below them, German territory stretched for miles, towns, forests, and rivers blanketed in snow. Every mile home felt impossible. As the crippled bomber limped west, a dark shape appeared in the distance. Charlie squinted through the cracked glass. It was moving fast. For a moment, his mind refused to believe what his eyes saw. A German Messerschmitt Bf-109, a deadly fighter, slicing through the clouds straight toward them. His stomach sank. They had no way to fight back. The gunners who were still conscious had no ammunition left. The bomber was a flying coffin now, slow and broken. He braced for the final attack. But when the fighter reached them, something unexpected happened. The German plane didn't open fire. Instead, it slowed down and moved closer, gliding beside the bomber until it was flying wing to wing. Through the shattered windows, Charlie could see the pilot clearly. A man in his 20s, calm, eyes sharp beneath his flight cap. That man was Franz Stigler, a Luftwaffe ace who had already earned medals for his skill in the air. For years, he had done what pilots were trained to do: destroy the enemy before the enemy destroyed you. Yet when he looked at the American plane beside him, he froze. He could see the damage. The tail gunner's position was torn open. The rudder was shredded. The bomber's body was riddled with holes, black smoke trailing behind. Inside, he could see the crew, faces pale and bloodied, some tending to the wounded, others slumped over. These men weren't a threat anymore. They were barely alive. Franz's finger hovered over the trigger, but he didn't pull it. Something deep inside stopped him. He remembered the words of his old commander, Gustav Rudel, who once told his men, "If I ever see you shoot at someone who's helpless, I will shoot you myself." Franz had carried those words in his heart since his first day as a fighter pilot. To him, the men inside that bomber weren't enemies. They were soldiers who had already lost. Killing them now would not be victory. It would be murder. He eased off the trigger and kept flying beside them. Inside the B-17, Charlie's crew was confused. The enemy wasn't attacking. Instead, the German fighter was staying with them, just off their wingtip. Charlie turned his head and met Franz's eyes through the small frosted window. For a long moment, they simply looked at each other. Two men on opposite sides of a brutal war, connected by a single instant of understanding. Franz gestured with his hands pointing downward, signaling for them to land. Charlie shook his head. To land in Germany meant capture, maybe worse. He pointed westward toward England. Franz understood. He could have flown away, left them to the mercy of German anti-aircraft guns that still dotted the land below. Instead, he made a decision that could cost him his life. He moved his fighter closer, flying in formation beside the bomber, using his presence as a shield. As they crossed German territory, he deliberately positioned his plane so that the gunners below would see a Luftwaffe aircraft escorting, not chasing, the bomber. Any German soldier looking up would assume this was a captured American plane being guided home by one of their own. It was the only way to protect them. For several long minutes, the two aircraft moved together through the frozen sky, predator and prey flying as one. When they finally reached the edge of the North Sea, Franz knew his mission was complete. England lay beyond the horizon. The Americans were safe. He turned his plane toward the bomber one last time, raised his hand in a salute, and broke away. The silver fighter rolled into the clouds and disappeared. Charlie and his crew sat in stunned silence. No one spoke for a while. They had been spared by their enemy. The man who could have ended their lives had instead given them back their chance to live. The B-17 somehow made it across the sea. It landed in England, battered almost beyond recognition. Mechanics who inspected it later said it was a miracle that the plane had stayed airborne at all. During debriefing, Charlie told his commanders the truth, that a German pilot had spared them and even escorted them to safety. But the officers ordered him to stay silent. They said the story could cause confusion, maybe even sympathy for the enemy. "You are not to tell anyone," they warned. "Not your crew, not other pilots." So he obeyed. He flew the rest of his missions, finished his service, and eventually returned home. He built a new life in America, married, raised children. But the memory of that day never left him. Sometimes, late at night, he'd wake up in a cold sweat, his wife or daughter finding him staring out the window, lost in thoughts of the German pilot who had chosen mercy instead of murder. He didn't know the man's name. He only remembered his face and the quiet salute that had stayed with him for decades. Meanwhile, across the ocean, Franz Stigler carried the same secret. When he landed that day near Bremen, he didn't tell anyone what he had done. Sparing an enemy bomber was a court-martial offense under the Nazi regime. If anyone found out, he could be executed. So he kept it to himself. He flew other missions, survived the chaos of war, and when Germany fell, he faced the ruins of a nation he no longer recognized. In 1953, he left Europe behind and moved to Canada. There he built a new life, worked, married, became a businessman. Outwardly, he seemed content, but inside, the memory of that crippled bomber haunted him. He would never forget the sight of the American crew, the wounded faces, the young pilot who had looked back at him with confusion and fear. Both men grew older, oceans apart, each wondering about the other. For Charlie, the war became a distant chapter, but that single encounter remained sharp. He often thought about writing a book or asking historians to help identify the German pilot, but he never found the right moment, until 1986. That year, a reunion of combat pilots called the Gathering of Eagles was held in the United States. Charlie was invited as a guest. During the event, someone asked if he had a memorable mission from the war. He hesitated, then decided to finally tell the story. The damaged bomber, the German fighter that had appeared on their wing, the escort to safety, and the salute. When he finished speaking, the room fell silent. Then came the questions. Did you ever find out who he was? Have you tried to locate him? Charlie realized he had spent more than 40 years wondering, but never truly searching. That night, he decided it was time. He began with official channels, writing letters to the U.S. Air Force, the German archives, and the historical offices that kept wartime records. He gave them the date, the approximate location, and the details of the German aircraft. But records were incomplete or lost, and the trail went cold. Months turned into years. Charlie refused to give up. He sent hundreds of letters, made phone calls to veteran associations, and even reached out to historians in Europe. Each time, he hit a wall. The Luftwaffe records from that period were scattered or destroyed. Finding one pilot from one specific day in 1943 seemed impossible. But the idea of that German's kindness and the mystery of his identity would not let him rest. Then in 1989, Charlie tried something new. He wrote a detailed account of the event and submitted it to a newsletter for combat pilots, a publication read by veterans in both America and Germany. In it, he described the entire encounter, the date, the damaged bomber, the markings on the German fighter, the salute. He hoped someone somewhere might recognize the story. He mailed the letter and waited. Thousands of miles away in Vancouver, Canada, Franz Stigler was now in his 70s. He had lived quietly for decades, but the war still lived inside him. When he came across that newsletter in early 1990, one story caught his eye. An American pilot describing an encounter from December 1943, a crippled bomber, and a German fighter that refused to fire. Franz read the words over and over, his hands trembling. The details were exact. The place, the damage, the salute. There could be no mistake. He sat down at his desk and began to write. His letter was short and simple. I was the one. He mailed it to Miami, where Charlie Brown lived. Days later, Charlie received the envelope. When he read those 4 words, he froze. His heart pounded. After nearly half a century, the man who had spared him had finally been found. He called the number written at the bottom of the letter. When Franz answered, they spoke for hours. Both men described what they remembered, filling in the missing pieces. Everything matched perfectly. The escort through German skies, the gestures, the salute. For the first time, Charlie could thank the man who had haunted his dreams for 47 years. 6 months later, they met in person. When Franz stepped out of the car at the Seattle airfield, he spotted Charlie standing there, tears already in his eyes. Franz walked straight to him, and the 2 men embraced, not as former enemies, but as brothers reunited by fate. They stood together for a long time, crying quietly, surrounded by cameras and onlookers who understood they were witnessing something rare. Forgiveness, gratitude, and humanity woven together in the aftermath of war. Franz looked at Charlie and said softly, "I love you, Charlie." In that moment, the distance of decades and the weight of nations disappeared. They spent the day talking, laughing, remembering. Charlie introduced Franz to the surviving members of his crew, men who owed their lives to the German pilot's mercy. Franz met their families, their children, their grandchildren. It struck him deeply. All these lives that existed because he had chosen compassion over obedience that cold December morning. From that day forward, the 2 men were inseparable. They spoke on the phone every week, traveled together to air shows and veterans gatherings, and told their story to anyone who would listen. One day, Franz gave Charlie a book. Inside, he wrote a note. In 1940, I lost my only brother as a night fighter. Thanks, Charlie. Your brother, Franz. Their friendship lasted 18 years. They celebrated birthdays together, visited schools, and appeared in interviews. Some people didn't understand. Franz received hateful letters from a few who called him a traitor for sparing an American crew. But he never regretted what he had done. For both men, their meeting was the most meaningful chapter of their lives. Charlie said his nightmares finally stopped after he found Franz. Franz often told people that saving those men was the only good thing that came from the war. In March 2008, Franz passed away in Vancouver at the age of 92. 8 months later, Charlie followed him, dying peacefully in Miami at 86. Though they were buried thousands of miles apart, their story remains bound together forever. 2 men who met for 10 minutes in the skies of war and became brothers for the rest of their lives. Their story would later inspire the best-selling book, A Higher Call, which brought their incredible act of mercy to millions. But long before the fame, before the recognition, there was only one simple truth. Even in the darkest moments of war, humanity can still shine through. Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler proved that compassion can cross even the deepest divides, and that sometimes the bravest thing a soldier can do is choose not to pull the trigger.